The massive chamber stretched across 3 kilometers of polished crystal floors that reflected the light of distant stars. Representatives from 12 different worlds sat in their designated areas, each section designed to accommodate the unique needs of their species. The air hummed with translation devices working overtime to convert thousands of different languages and communication methods into something resembling universal understanding. Ambassador Kalthara stood at the center podium, her tall crystalline form catching and refracting the chamber's light into rainbow patterns across the walls. Her voice carried the musical quality that all Zilani possessed, but today it held an edge of frustration that made her words sound sharp and brittle. "Honored council members," she began, her forearms gesturing in the formal patterns of diplomatic address, "we gather today to discuss a matter of galactic security. The species known as humans have expanded beyond their home system at an alarming rate. In the past 50 years, they have established colonies on 17 different worlds and show no signs of slowing their aggressive expansion." A low rumble of amusement rippled through the chamber. Council Prime Vertek of the Altarian Collective leaned back in his floating chair, his massive bulk shaking with barely contained laughter. His species had ruled their sector of space for over 10,000 years, and the idea that a race barely capable of faster-than-light travel could pose any serious threat struck him as absurd. Aggressive expansion? Vertek's voice boomed through the chamber's speakers. "These humans have been in space for less than a century. My people were building interstellar trade routes when their ancestors were still hitting rocks together to make fire." The other representatives joined in the laughter. The Keldari delegation, insect-like beings with compound eyes that sparkled with amusement, clicked their mandibles in what passed for chuckling among their kind. Even the normally serious Thylorian observers, creatures of pure energy who rarely showed emotion, pulsed with colors that indicated mild entertainment. Kalthara's crystalline features hardened into sharp angles. "You may find this amusing, but I assure you the threat is real. Humans are not like other species. They do not seek peaceful coexistence or mutual benefit. Their entire history is written in blood and conquest. They have never encountered a problem they did not attempt to solve through violence." From his position in the diplomatic viewing area, Ambassador Henry Collins watched the proceedings with growing anger. The human representative was a veteran of Earth's diplomatic corps, a man chosen specifically for his ability to remain calm under pressure. His weathered face and gray hair spoke of decades spent negotiating treaties and resolving conflicts. But even his considerable patience was being tested by the casual dismissal of his entire species. Beside him, Captain Jake Morrison of the UES Liberty shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The ship's commanding officer was younger than Collins, with the kind of steady demeanor that made him popular with his crew. He had volunteered to escort the ambassador to this historic first meeting with the Galactic Council, but he was beginning to wonder if they should have stayed home. "They are talking about us like we are dangerous animals," whispered Dr. Lisa Grant, the mission's xenobiologist. Her expertise in alien life forms had earned her a place on this diplomatic mission, but nothing in her studies had prepared her for the sheer arrogance she was witnessing. Kalthara continued her presentation, activating a holographic display that showed various scenes from human history. Images of ancient battles, world wars, and conflicts flashed through the air above the podium. Observe their record of behavior. In their brief existence, they have fought over territory, resources, ideology, and religion. They have developed weapons capable of destroying their own planet and came dangerously close to using them on multiple occasions. Representative Karthus of the Mindorian Fellowship, a being that resembled a floating jellyfish with glowing tendrils, pulsed with skeptical colors. All young species go through aggressive phases. It is part of natural development. Most civilizations learn to move beyond such primitive behaviors as they mature. But humans are different, Kelthara insisted. They embrace conflict. They celebrate warriors and create entertainment based on violence. Even their sports involve physical combat or symbolic warfare. This is not a phase they will outgrow. It is fundamental to their nature. Vertek waved one of his massive hands dismissively. Even if we accept your assessment, what possible threat could they pose to established civilizations? They barely understand energy manipulation. They still use primitive projectile weapons and chemical propulsion. Their most advanced warships would be no match for a single patrol craft from any of our fleets. The laughter grew louder. Several representatives began making jokes about human technological limitations. The Keldari delegation performed an elaborate mock battle using eating utensils to represent human weapons versus their own energy-based systems. The demonstration ended with the utensils being disintegrated by a small handheld device, causing another wave of amusement to sweep through the chamber. Dr. Grant clenched her fists so tightly her knuckles turned white. This is humiliating. They are treating us like children playing with toys. Collins placed a calming hand on her shoulder. Let them laugh. Sometimes underestimation can be an advantage. On the chamber floor, Kelthara was growing more frustrated. With each dismissive comment, you are not listening to the real concern. Humans do not think like us. When faced with superior technology or overwhelming odds, other species negotiate or surrender. Humans fight anyway. They develop new tactics, new weapons, new strategies. They adapt faster than any species we have encountered. Adaptation is hardly unique, commented Elder Zixara of the Vorthek Confederacy, her ancient voice crackling through the translation system. Intelligence evolves. Technology advances. These are universal constants. Not like this, Kelthara replied. Most species develop along predictable paths. They discover energy manipulation, then consciousness transfer, then reality alteration. Each step takes millennia and follows established patterns. Humans skip steps. They find alternative solutions. They refuse to accept that something is impossible. The chamber fell briefly quiet as the representatives considered this claim. Then, Vertek spoke again, his tone condescending and amused. You speak as if unpredictability were a strength rather than a weakness. Chaos may seem impressive to primitive minds, but order and logic will always prevail. Our civilizations have endured for tens of thousands of years, precisely because we have learned to move beyond such random behavior. The formal voting began. Shortly after, one by one, each delegation recorded their position on Kelthara's proposal to ban human expansion beyond their current colonies. The Altarian collective voted no, stating that the proposal was unnecessary and based on unfounded fears. The Mendorian Fellowship agreed, adding that restricting a developing species would set a dangerous precedent. The Thelorian observers abstained, as was their custom, but their energy patterns suggested they found the entire discussion trivial. Even the Keldari, despite their usual support for Zelani positions, voted against the ban. Their representative stated that humans seemed no more dangerous than any other young species, and that the galaxy had room for diversity in development paths. The final tally was overwhelming. 11 delegations voted against the proposal, with only the Zelani Empire supporting it. Even Kelthara's closest allies had abandoned her position. As the session concluded, various representatives approached the human delegation area. Their comments were polite but patronizing. They spoke of humanity's potential once they matured past their violent phase. They offered guidance and suggested that humans would benefit from observing more advanced civilizations to learn proper behavior. Throughout these exchanges, Collins maintained his diplomatic smile and responded with appropriate gratitude. But Jake Morrison noticed that the ambassador's hands remained clenched behind his back, and Dr. Grant had stopped responding to questions altogether. As they prepared to leave the chamber, Collins turned to his companions. Well, that could have gone better. At least they did not approve the ban, Morrison replied. We can continue our expansion plans. For now, Collins said quietly, but this is not over. They have made their position clear. They think we are primitive children who will eventually learn to behave properly. They have no idea what humans are really capable of when pushed too hard. None of them knew that their words were being proved prophetic at that very moment. 3 months earlier, something had happened to the mining colony on Kepler 442b that would soon make the Galactic Council realize just how wrong they had been about humanity. The footage had not yet reached them, but when it did, their laughter would turn to screams. The humans departed the station quietly, their small ship dwarfed by the massive vessels of the other delegations. Behind them, the council members continued their discussions, already moving on to other matters they considered more important. The human problem, as far as they were concerned, had been settled through rational discourse and superior wisdom. They had no way of knowing that somewhere, in the dark spaces between stars, ancient predators were stirring. The morning started like any other on Kepler 442b. Chief Mining Supervisor Carl Bennett woke to the sound of machinery humming through the colony's walls and the familiar vibration of the deep core. Extractors working 3 kilometers below ground. He had been running this operation for 8 years now, watching it grow from a small outpost of 40 people to a thriving community of 847 souls. Bennett pulled on his work clothes and checked the daily production reports on his tablet. Numbers looked good. They were ahead of schedule on the rare earth extraction that Earth desperately needed for their expanding space program. The colonists had found a rhythm here on this distant world, creating something that felt almost like home despite being 17 light years from Earth. The colony stretched across a valley between 2 mountain ranges that reminded many settlers of the American Southwest. The main buildings were constructed from local stone and metal, giving them a permanence that the prefabricated structures of newer colonies lacked. Gardens grew in the courtyards where families had planted flowers and vegetables from Earth, adding splashes of familiar color to the alien landscape. Children ran through the streets on their way to school, their laughter echoing off the canyon walls. The youngest had been born here and knew no other home. They spoke with slight accents that mixed Earth English with terms they had invented for local phenomena. To them, the twin suns rising over the eastern peaks were as normal as sunrise had been to their parents back on Earth. Tracy Adams was working the morning shift in the communications center when the first anomaly appeared on her screens. The young woman had joined the colony 2 years earlier, fresh out of technical school and eager for adventure. She monitored all incoming and outgoing transmissions, maintained contact with Earth, and coordinated with a handful of other human settlements within range. The sensors picked up movement at the edge of the system first. Tracy assumed it was another supply ship arriving early, though none were scheduled for 3 weeks. She tried to establish contact using standard protocols, sending identification requests and docking instructions. The response she received made her blood run cold. There was no response at all. Just silence. Tracy ran more detailed scans and discovered that the approaching objects were not following standard flight patterns. They moved in ways that seemed to ignore basic physics, accelerating and turning without visible propulsion systems. Their hulls appeared organic, almost alive, with surfaces that seemed to pulse and shift as she watched. She immediately contacted Bennett in his office. "Sir, we have incoming vessels of unknown configuration. They are not responding to our hails, and they do not match any ships in our database." Bennett hurried to the communications center and studied the sensor readings. His 8 years of experience Managing remote operations had taught him to trust his instincts, and every instinct he possessed was screaming danger. The approaching ships moved like predators stalking prey, maintaining formations that suggested coordination and intelligence. "Sound the general alarm," Bennett ordered. "Get everyone to the emergency shelters. This does not feel right." The colony had practiced emergency procedures many times. Within minutes, families were moving in orderly groups toward the reinforced bunkers built into the mountainside. These shelters had been designed to protect against natural disasters, equipment failures, and the theoretical possibility of hostile contact with unknown species. They were not designed for what was coming. Danny Price was working in mining tunnel 7 when the alarm sounded. The young engineer had been checking the stability of a new excavation when the warning echoes bounced through the underground passages. He gathered his tools and headed for the surface, following emergency protocols that required all personnel to report to designated safety areas. He never made it that far. The first ship landed while Danny was still climbing toward ground level. Through the tunnel entrance, he could see a vessel that defied every principle of engineering he understood. It seemed to be part machine and part living tissue, with appendages that moved independently and surfaces that rippled like water. Then the screaming started. The sounds that came through the communication system were unlike anything Danny had ever heard. They contained frequencies that seemed to bypass his ears and strike directly at his nervous system, causing his hands to shake and his vision to blur. Mixed with the inhuman sounds were human voices, calling for help in tones of absolute terror. Security. Chief Betty Morse was coordinating the defense from the command bunker when the reports started coming in. Her team of 37 security personnel were equipped with mining lasers and basic projectile weapons designed for dealing with dangerous wildlife or potential equipment malfunctions. They had never expected to face actual combat. They are not just attacking, Morse reported to Bennett over the crackling communication system. They are hurting people, like they are collecting livestock. Through the security cameras, Morse watched scenes that violated everything she thought she knew about the universe. The creatures that emerged from the ships moved with fluid grace. That suggested they were not bound by normal physical laws. They flowed through the colony's defenses like water through a screen, ignoring walls and barriers that should have stopped them. The colonists who tried to run found themselves driven toward specific gathering points. Those who tried to hide were somehow located no matter how well concealed they thought they were. The creatures seemed to see through solid matter, or perhaps sense the bioelectric fields that all living beings produced. Worse than the efficiency of the attack was its purpose. These beings were not killing randomly or destroying property. They were studying the humans, examining them with an intelligence that was clearly ancient and utterly alien. Some colonists were taken immediately, while others were left alone, as if the creatures were making selections based on criteria no human could understand. Bennett made the decision to retreat to the deep mining tunnels. The underground passages extended for kilometers in multiple directions, offering maze-like complexity that might confuse the attackers. The remaining colonists, now numbering fewer than 200, gathered what supplies they could carry and descended into the depths of their own excavations. For 6 days, they held out in the darkness below ground. The tunnels that had once represented prosperity and progress became their final refuge. They rationed food and water while listening to the sounds of the creatures moving through the abandoned colony above them. Emergency messages were broadcast continuously toward Earth and any ship that might be within range. The automated systems repeated their pleas for help, even as the colonists who had recorded them began to disappear one by one from their underground hiding places. The creatures, it seemed, could move through solid rock as easily as they moved. Through air. On the 3rd day, mining engineer Lucy Shaw discovered scratch marks on the tunnel walls that had not been there before. The marks formed patterns that looked almost like writing, as if the creatures were leaving messages for each other. Below the scratches, she found human bones that had been gnawed clean by teeth designed for purposes she did not want to contemplate. By the 5th day, the survivors realized that their attackers were not just hunting them. They were learning from them. The creatures' tactics became more sophisticated with each encounter, as if they were studying human behavior and adapting their methods accordingly. Technical Specialist Roger Hunt managed to access the colony's main computer system from a hidden terminal in the deepest tunnel. What he found in the security recordings made him understand the true horror of their situation. The creatures were not just killing colonists. They were somehow absorbing their knowledge, their memories, their very essence. On the 6th day, the screaming stopped. The tunnels fell silent, except for the drip of water and the distant hum of machinery still operating automatically in the abandoned sections above. The remaining survivors, now fewer than 30, knew that silence meant their friends and families were gone. Carl Bennett spent his final hours carving a message into the tunnel wall using a mining laser. His hands shook as he worked, but he forced himself to complete the warning that might save others from the same fate. The words he burned into the rock were simple but urgent. They are coming for Earth. They know where we are now. Warn them. When the rescue ship arrived 3 weeks later, they found a colony that looked almost normal from orbit. The buildings stood intact, the machinery continued to operate, and the solar collectors still fed power to the settlement systems. It was only when they landed and began to explore that they discovered the truth. Kepler 442b had become a tomb, a perfectly preserved monument to human ambition that had encountered something older and hungrier than anything the galaxy had prepared them to face. The colonists were gone, but they had left behind evidence of their final days and a warning that would soon reach the very council members who had dismissed humanity as too primitive to matter. In the deepest mining tunnel, Carl Bennett's message waited in the darkness like a prophecy carved in stone. The creatures that had consumed his colony were already moving toward their next target, armed with human knowledge and driven by an ancient hunger that had waited millennia to feed again. Commander Rick Turner was 3 weeks into a routine patrol when the distress beacon reached his ship. The UES Ranger had been conducting standard border sweeps along the outer edge of human space, checking for pirates or equipment failures that might threaten the scattered colonies. It was boring work that Turner usually enjoyed, because boring meant safe. The signal changed everything. Navigator Susan Clark was monitoring communications when the automated distress call appeared on her screens. The young officer had excellent technical skills, but limited experience with actual emergencies. When she saw the beacon's origin point, her face went pale. "Captain, we have an automated distress signal from Kepler 442b. The transmission is weak and intermittent, but it matches the colony's emergency frequency." Turner had served in the Earth Space Navy for 15 years. He had dealt with equipment failures, medical emergencies, and the occasional conflict with raiders who preyed on isolated settlements. But something about this particular signal made his skin crawl. The beacon was not following standard emergency protocols. Instead of the normal repeating pattern that indicated specific types of problems, it was broadcasting a single continuous tone that seemed to pulse with its own rhythm. "Set course for Kepler 442b, Turner ordered. "Maximum speed." The Ranger was a mid-sized patrol vessel with a crew of 41. It carried enough firepower to handle small threats and sufficient medical facilities to deal with typical colonial emergencies. Turner hoped it would be enough for whatever they were about to encounter. The journey to Kepler 442b took 4 days at maximum hyperspace velocity. During the trip, Turner briefed his senior staff on what they knew about the mining colony. Carl Bennett ran a successful operation that had been expanding steadily for 8 years. The colonists were experienced professionals with good safety records and reliable equipment. There was no reason to expect serious problems. When the Ranger dropped out of hyperspace near Kepler 442b, they found a scene that defied explanation. The orbital processing stations that normally handled refined materials hung lifeless in space. Their hulls bore massive tiers that looked like they had been made by claws rather than weapons or explosions. "My God," whispered Chief Medical Officer Peter Young as he studied the sensor readings. What could do that to reinforced steel? Turner ordered a full scan of the system before approaching the planet. The results showed no other ships present and no signs of active hostilities. Whatever had happened here was already over. The question was whether anyone had survived to tell them what had occurred. The first landing party consisted of 12 people, led by Dr. Young. They took a shuttle down to the colony's main landing pad and found the settlement eerily intact. The buildings showed no signs of damage from orbit, and the solar collectors continued to generate power for the automated systems. It was only when they began exploring on foot that they discovered the horror. Engineering specialist Linda Wood was recording everything with her camera as they moved through the colony's main plaza. The area should have been bustling with activity during the day shift, but instead they found it covered in a crystalline substance that seemed to pulse with its own inner light. The crystal formations were beautiful in a way that made them even more disturbing. Embedded within the crystal were human shapes, not bodies, but perfect impressions of people caught in moments of terror. The expressions on their faces were frozen in time, showing fear and confusion that spoke of something beyond normal human experience. "They look like they were flash frozen," Wood reported, her voice shaking as she continued filming. "But the crystal is warm to the touch and seems to be organic rather than mineral." Security Officer Frank Bell led a team to investigate the colony's residential areas. They found homes that looked lived in but abandoned, with meals still sitting on tables, and children's toys scattered on floors. Personal belongings remained untouched, suggesting that whatever had happened occurred too quickly for people to gather their possessions. In the colony's security center, Bell discovered recordings from the final days. The automated systems had continued operating even after the colonists disappeared, capturing footage that made Bell's blood run cold. The images showed creatures that seemed to exist partially outside normal reality, moving like liquid shadow with substance that defied physics. The colonists' weapons passed harmlessly through these beings, but their claws tore through human flesh with terrifying efficiency. The creatures moved with intelligence and purpose, herding people toward specific locations and making selections based on criteria that no human mind could understand. Dr. Young was examining the medical data when he made a discovery that turned his stomach. The final health monitoring records showed that the colonists had not simply been killed. They had been processed in some way that trained them of something fundamental to their existence. They were not just dying, Young reported to Turner over the communication system. Something was being extracted from them. Their life signs did not follow normal patterns of injury or disease. It was like they were being consumed from the inside out. The most disturbing discovery came in the deepest mining tunnels. Technical specialist Alan Rice was part of the team exploring the underground passages when they found evidence of the colonists' final stand. Scratch marks covered the tunnel walls in patterns that looked almost like writing, as if the creatures had been leaving messages for each other. Below the scratches, they found human bones that had been gnawed clean by teeth designed for purposes no one wanted to contemplate. The bones were arranged in ways that suggested intelligence rather than random feeding, as if the creatures had been studying human anatomy while they consumed their victims. At the very bottom of the deepest shaft, they found Carl Bennett's final message carved into the rock wall with a mining laser. The words were burned deep into the stone, created by a man who knew he was about to die, but was determined to warn others of what was coming. They are coming for Earth. They know where we are now. Warn them. Turner immediately transmitted their findings to Earth Command and to the Galactic Council Station, where Ambassador Collins was still stationed. The report included all the video footage, medical data, and physical evidence they had collected. The images were disturbing, and the implications were terrifying, but Turner made sure to document everything thoroughly. The response from Earth Command was swift and concerned. Admiral Patricia Lewis ordered increased patrols along the border and began preparing defensive measures for the inner colonies. Earth's military leaders took the threat seriously because they understood that their people had died here. The Galactic Council's response was entirely different. Ambassador Kelthara reviewed the human report with growing irritation. The footage was clearly fabricated, she decided, probably using advanced special effects technology that humans had developed for their entertainment industry. The whole thing was obviously a hoax designed to gain sympathy and support for human expansion efforts. Primitive species often resort to deception when their legitimate concerns are dismissed, Kelthara explained to her fellow council members. They are trying to create a fictional threat that will force us to take them seriously. Council Prime Vertek agreed completely. His analysis of the footage revealed several inconsistencies that proved human involvement in creating the scenes. The creatures in the recordings moved in ways that violated known physics, which meant they could not be real. The humans had simply gotten better at creating convincing illusions. This is exactly the kind of behavior we would expect from a species that solves problems through deception and manipulation, Vantek announced. They cannot compete with advanced civilizations through legitimate means, so they resort to elaborate lies designed to make us afraid. The council voted unanimously to dismiss the human claims as fraudulent. They filed the report under primitive species attention-seeking behavior and moved on to more important matters. A few representatives made jokes about human creativity, suggesting that their talent for fiction might eventually lead to useful entertainment exports. Meanwhile, the Ranger remained in orbit around Kepler 442b, continuing to search for survivors and evidence. They found neither. The colony had been completely consumed by something that left no trace of its presence except for the crystalline formations and the bones in the tunnels. As Turner prepared to return to Earth with his findings, he could not shake the feeling that they were being watched. Several crew members reported strange dreams and unexplained sensations during their time in the system. The ship's sensors occasionally detected movement where nothing should exist, but the readings never lasted long enough to be confirmed. On their final night in orbit, Communications Officer Janet White picked up a transmission that made no sense. It was not directed at the Ranger specifically, but seemed to be broadcasting toward the inner systems where Earth and the major colonies were located. The message was in no language she recognized, but something about its rhythm reminded her of the sounds carnivorous animals made when they were hunting. Turner ordered an immediate departure for Earth. As the Ranger jumped to hyperspace, none of the crew looked back at Kepler 442b. They had seen enough of what that world had become. The Void Hunters had tasted human consciousness and found it unlike anything they had consumed in their millennia of existence. Other species they had devoured possessed ordered minds that followed predictable patterns, making them easy to process and absorb. But humans were different in ways that made their life force intoxicating and their knowledge invaluable. From their hidden dimensional spaces between the stars, the hunters began to move with purpose. They had learned much from the Kepler colony. They understood human technology now, knew the locations of Earth and all the scattered settlements, and most importantly, they had discovered that this chaotic species could provide them with something they had never encountered before. The humans fought even when victory was impossible, They adapted faster than logic suggested they should. They refused to accept defeat, even in the face of overwhelming odds. These qualities made their consciousness particularly rich and nourishing, but they also made humans potentially useful in ways the hunters had not initially considered. Admiral Patricia Lewis commanded the Earth Defense Fleet from her flagship, the U.S. Constitution. When the first reports began arriving of ships vanishing along the outer rim, she immediately recognized the pattern. These were not random pirate attacks or equipment failures. Something was systematically probing human defenses and learning their capabilities. "They are testing us," Lewis explained to her senior staff during an emergency briefing in the ship's main conference room. "Each attack is more sophisticated than the last. Whatever we are facing is studying our response times, our weapons, our tactics. This is coordinated intelligence gathering." Captain Steve Murphy commanded the UES Guardian, a heavy cruiser patrolling the Centauri system. His crew of 203 was conducting routine security sweeps when the sensors detected massive gravitational distortions at the edge of the system. Murphy had 20 years of experience in space combat, but nothing had prepared him for what appeared on his view screen. Reality itself seemed to tear open as organic ships poured through dimensional rifts that violated every law of physics he understood. The vessels moved like living creatures, rather than constructed machines, with hulls that shifted and flowed as if they were made of liquid metal, guided by alien intelligence. "All hands to battle stations," Murphy ordered, though he knew his. Single ships stood no chance against the swarm approaching them. The Guardian was well armed for dealing with human threats, but these creatures seemed to exist partially outside normal spacetime. The battle lasted 17 minutes. Murphy's crew fought with the desperate courage that had made humanity feared. Among the galaxy's more peaceful species, but their weapons seemed to have little effect on the shifting hulls of the hunter ships. Energy beams passed through them like they were firing at shadows, while projectile weapons struck surfaces that absorbed the impact without visible damage. The hunters, meanwhile, adapted to every tactic the humans employed. When the Guardian tried evasive maneuvers, the alien ships predicted their movements. When they concentrated fire on single targets, the hunters shifted their formations to minimize damage. Most disturbing of all, the creatures seemed to be learning human combat techniques in real time and incorporating them into their own strategies. The Guardian's final transmission reached Earth Defense Command just before the ship was consumed by tendrils of energy that seemed to be alive. Murphy's last words were broadcast across the entire human fleet. "They are not just ships. They are alive. And they are learning our tactics faster than we can develop new ones." Colony after colony began falling silent across human space. New Boston on Proxima b, a thriving settlement of 12,000 people, stopped responding to communications overnight. The research station at Wolf 359, where humanity's best scientists were developing new propulsion technologies, transmitted a brief distress call before going dark forever. The agricultural dome on Tau Ceti, which supplied food to 6 different worlds, sent increasingly desperate messages as something stalked through their growing chambers. The final transmission showed creatures that seemed to phase in and out of existence, immune to the colonists' weapons, but perfectly capable of tearing through human flesh and bone. Each attack was more sophisticated than the last. The hunters were not simply destroying human settlements. They were studying them, learning from them, and incorporating human knowledge into their own understanding of the galaxy. They absorbed tactical information from military installations, technological data from research facilities, and cultural knowledge from civilian populations. Earth's government sent increasingly urgent messages to the Galactic Council, requesting assistance, or at least sharing information about the threat they were facing. The responses from the council members were coldly dismissive and consistently unhelpful. Ambassador Kelthara's official reply was typical of the council's attitude. Human paranoia and technological incompetence do not constitute a galactic emergency. These reported incidents are most likely the result of equipment failures, navigation errors, or conflicts between human factions. We suggest that Earth's government focus on improving their colonial management practices rather than creating fictional threats to excuse their failures. But deep in the Council's vast archives, elderly Keeper Zorthik was conducting research that filled him with growing dread. The descriptions in the human reports had triggered memories of legends he had dismissed as primitive superstition from the early days of galactic civilization. The ancient texts spoke of creatures called the Devourers of Stars, beings that existed in the spaces between dimensions and fed on the life force of entire civilizations. The legends described them as shapeshifters that could phase through matter at will, immune to conventional weapons, but capable of tearing apart any defense through sheer persistence and adaptability. Most disturbing were the references to their intelligence. The Devourers were not mindless predators, but ancient beings with memories spanning millions of years. They had supposedly been imprisoned by the combined efforts of 50 different species at the cost of thousands of worlds and billions of lives. Zorthak cross-referenced the human reports with fragments of historical records that most scholars considered mythological. The similarities were too numerous to be coincidental. The creatures the humans described matched the ancient descriptions in every significant detail. As more reports continued to arrive from human space, Zorthik made a terrifying realization. If the legends were true, then humanity had not simply encountered dangerous predators. They had somehow awakened beings that had been imprisoned since before most current civilizations existed. The hunters were not just attacking human colonies. They were free, they were learning, and they possessed knowledge of every species that had once fought to contain them. Worse still, they had apparently found something in human consciousness that resonated with their own nature, something that made this chaotic young species valuable to them in ways that threatened the entire galaxy. Admiral Lewis received reports from across human space that painted an increasingly desperate picture. The attacks were accelerating, with multiple colonies going silent each day. The pattern suggested that the hunters were not just consuming human settlements, but were actively preparing for something larger. Intelligence analysis indicated that the creatures were establishing bases in the outer systems, using consumed human knowledge to build infrastructure that combined alien technology with human adaptability. They were not planning to simply destroy humanity. They were incorporating human characteristics into their own capabilities. Captain Sarah Brooks of the Deep Space Reconnaissance Vessel UES Explorer managed to observe one of these hybrid facilities from long range before her ship was detected and barely escaped. Her report described structures that seemed to grow rather than being constructed, powered by energy sources that defied human understanding of physics. "They are not just killing us," Brooks reported to Earth Command. "They are studying us, learning from us, becoming more like us. Whatever these things were before they found us, they are evolving into something new, something that combines their ancient knowledge with human unpredictability." The most chilling discovery came from the recovered logs of the research station at Vega Prime. Before the facility was consumed, the scientists there had managed to analyze energy signatures from the hunter ships. The readings suggested that these creatures existed partially outside normal spacetime, which explained their ability to phase through matter and appear anywhere without warning. But the data also revealed something else. The hunters were not originally from this dimension. They had been forced into the spaces between realities by some ancient catastrophe or deliberate imprisonment. Their recent freedom suggested that whatever had contained them for so long had finally failed. Earth's military leaders began preparing for the inevitable assault on the home system. They knew that all the outer colonies were likely lost, and that humanity's survival now depended on their ability to defend their birth world against enemies that seemed immune to conventional warfare. The irony was not lost on Admiral Lewis as she reviewed the defensive preparations. The Galactic Council had dismissed humans as too primitive and chaotic to be taken seriously. The footage arrived at the Galactic Council Station on a routine data transmission from the Deep Space Monitoring Station at Vega Prime. Technician Gary White had been working the night shift when his sensors detected an anomaly at the system's outer edge. What he captured on the station's long-range cameras would haunt every being who viewed it for the rest of their lives. Ambassador Collins had included the recording with his daily reports to the Council, though he held little hope that the member species would take it seriously. The previous months had shown him that the galaxy's advanced civilizations were perfectly content to dismiss human concerns as primitive paranoia or elaborate deception. The recording began with routine sensor data showing empty space near the edge of the Vega system. Then reality began to twist and fold in ways that violated every law of physics the galaxy's scientists thought they understood. Dimensional rifts opened like wounds in space-time itself, and through these tears came ships that seemed to be constructed from living nightmares. Member Kelthara watched the footage from her crystalline throne, her forearms folded in an expression of skeptical dismissal. She had seen enough human fabrications to recognize their crude special effects technology. But as the recording continued, her confidence began to waver. The ships emerging from the dimensional rifts were attacking a Zalani exploration fleet that had been conducting routine surveys in the area. 12 vessels carrying 8,000 of Kelthara people were facing an enemy that should not have been able to exist. The Zalani possessed the most advanced technology in the galaxy. Their energy shields could deflect the radiation from dying stars. Their weapons could crack moons in half. Their hulls were constructed from crystalline composites that had never been penetrated by any known force in 10,000 years of space. Travel, none of it mattered. The creatures flowed through the Zalani shields like they were not there at all. Their organic ships wrapped around the crystalline vessels with appendages that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Within minutes, the screaming began. The audio feeds transmitted terror in frequencies that transcended species barriers. Even the council members who communicated through electromagnetic pulses or chemical exchanges found themselves understanding the agony being broadcast from the dying Zalani ships. "By the ancient stars," whispered Council Prime Vertek, his massive bulk trembling as recognition dawned in his 4 eyes. "The old hunger has returned." The footage continued with scenes that violated every principle of civilized warfare. The hunters were not simply destroying the Zalani fleet. They were processing the crews in ways that defied description, harvesting something fundamental from their victims, while leaving behind empty husks that moved with unnatural jerky motions. But the most terrifying moment came when the hunter ships turned toward the monitoring station's cameras. Somehow, impossibly, they knew they were being observed. Through the vacuum of space, across distances that should have made communication impossible, something spoke directly into the minds of everyone viewing the footage. The voice that echoed through the council chamber was older than civilizations, filled with hunger that had been building for millennia. It spoke in harmonics that bypassed translation systems and struck directly at the primitive fear centers in every species' brain. "We remember you, Council of the Weak. We remember your ancestors who caged us between the stars while they lived, in luxury built on our suffering. But the humans are different. They fight as we fight. They hunger as we hunger. They refuse to accept defeat, even when victory is impossible. Through them, we have learned to be free again." The transmission ended with the monitoring station itself being consumed, Technician White's final scream cutting off abruptly, as his consciousness was absorbed into the collective hunger of beings that had waited eons for revenge. In the silence that followed, Ambassador Collins stood slowly from his seat in the diplomatic viewing area. His weathered face showed no satisfaction at being proven right, only grim determination mixed with barely controlled anger. "This is what you dismissed as human paranoia," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the chamber despite its quiet tone. "This is what you mocked as primitive fear. Our colonies, our ships, our people have been dying while you laughed at our warnings." Kelthara's crystalline form was trembling so violently that light refracted through her body in chaotic patterns. The old texts spoke of the Devourers, but they were myths. Legends from the dawn of civilization. Stories told to frighten children. "Not myths," said Keeper Zorthik, his ancient voice filled with dread as he accessed records that had not been consulted for thousands of years. "History. My people remember the last time they stirred. It took the combined might of 50 species to force them back into dimensional exile. Entire star systems were sacrificed to create the prison that held them." The elderly Keeper's tentacles moved frantically across his data interface as he pulled up files that most council members had never seen. The documents told of a war that had consumed half the galaxy, fought against enemies that existed partially outside reality, and fed on the life force of entire civilizations. "The prison was supposed to be eternal," Zorthek continued, his voice breaking with horror as he read the ancient reports. "It was built from the sacrifice of billions of lives and powered by the death of stars. Nothing should have been able to break those bonds." Collins walked to the center of the chamber, his human frame small among the towering alien forms, but his presence commanding attention through sheer force of will. "And now they are free because a young species you considered too primitive to take seriously happened to expand into space at the wrong time and place." The implications struck every council member simultaneously. The Void Hunters had not simply escaped their prison. They had been freed by contact with human consciousness, with minds that resonated with their own chaotic nature in ways that no other species could match. Representative Karthus of the Mendorian Fellowship pulsed with colors of absolute terror. "If they have absorbed human knowledge and human unpredictability, then they are no longer the same enemy our ancestors fought. They have evolved beyond our ability to contain them." The chamber erupted in panicked discussions as the full scope of the threat became clear. The Hunters were not just attacking humans. They were loose in the galaxy with knowledge of every species that had once imprisoned them, armed with human adaptability and driven by hunger for revenge that had been building for millions of years. Emergency sessions were called. Ancient defense protocols that had not been activated since the dawn of recorded history were frantically researched. Military leaders from a dozen different species began coordinating responses to an enemy that their ancestors had barely defeated, at the cost of half their civilizations. But it was already too late. The footage showed timestamps indicating that the attack on the Zelani fleet had occurred weeks earlier. By now, the Hunters would have processed the knowledge and technology of one of the galaxy's most advanced species, adding Zelani capabilities to human unpredictability and their own ancient MALEVOLENCE. As Collins prepared to return to his ship, Captain Morrison met him at the chamber's exit. The ship's commander looked older than he had when they first arrived at the council station, aged by the weight of responsibility and the knowledge of what was coming. "Sir, we are receiving reports from Earth Command. The Hunter ships have been spotted moving toward the inner systems. But there is something else. The attacks on our outer colonies have stopped completely." Collins nodded grimly. "They have learned everything they need from us. Now they are preparing for the final assault." He looked back at the council chamber, where alien representatives were still arguing about response strategies and evacuation plans. Most of them were already planning to flee to the furthest edges of the galaxy, hoping to escape the attention of enemies they had helped to awaken through their own arrogance. "Maybe that is why they called us different," Collins said quietly. "Maybe that is why they needed us to break free. We do not surrender when faced with impossible odds. We do not run when confronted with superior enemies. We adapt, we fight, and we find ways to win, even when victory seems impossible. Through the Liberty's view screen, Collins could see the stars that had once seemed friendly and welcoming. Now they concealed ancient horrors that had tasted human consciousness and found it intoxicating. Somewhere out there, beings older than civilizations were preparing to consume everything the galaxy had built over millions of years. The Council's mockery had ended. The representatives who had dismissed humanity as too primitive to matter were now facing the consequences of their arrogance. They had laughed at human warnings and ignored human pleas for help. Now they would discover what humans had always known about survival in a universe that cared nothing for the hopes and dreams of any species. Sometimes, the only way to survive was to fight with everything you had, even when victory seemed impossible. Sometimes being too primitive to know when you were beaten was the greatest advantage of all. The real war was just beginning. Tours had returned,